Dawn crawled over the fog-drenched valley of Hollow Creek, a quiet town nestled among the rolling hills of southern Kentucky. In 1879, its mornings began with the smell of wet soil, wood smoke, and fear, though no one yet dared to name that last scent. People whispered about miracles in places where the earth had once cracked like scorched bread. Others whispered about the angel. It began in the winter of that year, when a stranger walked into town with a torn black coat and eyes that seemed to carry the light of a dying fire. He said his name was Samuel Leroux, a traveling preacher. He spoke softly, almost tenderly, but his words dug into the hearts of those who listened. In a town with more graves than living souls, Samuel's voice sounded like salvation. The first place he visited was the burned church near the riverbend. The old congregation had abandoned it years before, after a lightning storm set its steeple ablaze. Samuel stood in front of its charred frame for an hour, saying nothing, before he turned to the handful of onlookers who had gathered in the mud. They waited for his sermon, expecting the usual verses about mercy and forgiveness. What they got instead was a promise. He told them that God had led him there to bring Hollow Creek back to life, that he would help the farmers reclaim their crop, the sick return to health, and the dying find peace without fear. In a land where doctors were few and hope was rarer still, the town listened. By nightfall, he already had a following. The first life he touched belonged to Clara Mae Denson, a girl no older than 17, who had been bedridden for months with a fever that burned hotter than coal. Her mother pleaded for help. The preacher placed his hands on the girl's forehead and whispered something no one could quite make out. When he lifted his hands, the girl's eyes opened, her skin cool like spring rain. She began to breathe steady, for the first time in weeks. By morning, the story had spread. People started bringing him the sick, the broken, the hopeless. Men came dragging their brothers from the mines, women clutching infants barely breathing. Samuel prayed, always softly, always with that same distant look, and one by one they seemed to recover. No one questioned it. No one dared. But something lurked beneath that calm. When Samuel preached in the burned church that had become his new chapel, flames would shimmer faintly in the shadows behind him, but no fire burned there. Several said they saw the light flicker like wings. Others claimed they heard the low hum of burning coals when he spoke, though there were no stoves, no lanterns, nothing but cold air. Within a month, Samuel Leroux was the most powerful man in Hollow Creek. He didn't demand money or gifts, but people gave them anyway. Workers from the coal pits built benches, widows donated their dead husbands' jackets for the altar, and children carved wooden angels with black wings, the symbol Samuel had described in his sermons. Then the revivals began. Once a week, he gathered the town by the river under torchlight. There he preached that salvation wasn't given, it was earned through devotion and cleansing. Every soul must burn away its sin, he would say, so light may live where darkness has grown too deep. The crowd would shout, "Amen," never noticing how often the wind seemed to shift when he spoke, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke. Sheriff Amos Calloway was the only one who doubted him. A Civil War veteran with one eye and a heart hardened by loss, Amos saw things differently. He didn't like the way Samuel's congregation stared at him, nor how they began to turn against anyone who didn't follow. One evening he found a dead fox by his door, its fur singed and body arranged as if praying. Someone had left it there, Amos thought, but he didn't tell anyone. He just started keeping his rifle within reach. By early March, the town had changed. The saloon was empty. The church was full. The laughter of children vanished, replaced by hymns written by Samuel himself. Strange, rhythmic verses that sounded less like songs and more like warnings. People stopped working on Sundays, then on Mondays, then most days altogether. They waited instead for instructions. Samuel began selecting certain followers to stay close. He called them the purified. They lived with him near the burned church and rarely spoke with others. Their eyes were hollow, and their smiles stretched too long. When asked what they did, they'd only say, "Preparing the flame." No one knew what that meant. Then came the drought. The rains ended abruptly in mid-April, and the fields turned to dust within weeks. Wells dried. The river shrank to a sluggish stream, thin as a vein. The town begged Samuel for answers. He told them that faith was being tested, that only those who endured the fire of hardship would be saved. His words spread like sparks. No one questioned him, though hunger and thirst began to hollow the town's faith into madness. One night, at the crest of the dry riverbed, Samuel stood before his congregation, eyes glowing under the torchlight. He spoke of purification through flame once more, but this time his tone changed. It wasn't about endurance anymore, but surrender. Only through burning, he told them, can the impure be freed. Behind him, the purified stood holding torches that burned an eerie orange-white flame, brighter than oil. Someone in the crowd whispered about the burning foxes, others about the livestock found charred without smoke. But fear silenced them. Among the watchers, Sheriff Calloway slowly backed away, feeling something shift in the air, a truth no one else dared see. This was no savior, no angel. That night, the first house burned. People said it was an accident, a lantern kicked over by a startled horse. But Amos knew better. The house belonged to Lena Cobb, one of the few who had refused to join Samuel's flock. In the ashes, he found something no fire should leave behind, a mark burned into the dirt shaped like wings. When dawn broke, Samuel stood before the ruins and prayed for the dead. Behind his bowed head, the purified smiled. The town didn't speak of it. They simply built a pyre at the church for atonement, and Hollow Creek, once peaceful and small, began to die slowly, in silence, in devotion, and under the glow of firelight reflected in the eyes of a man who called himself the Angel. But the sheriff wasn't done watching, and what he would uncover in the next weeks would turn every whispered miracle into a confession carved in flame. The morning after Lena Cobb's house turned to ash, Hollow Creek awoke to a new kind of silence, the kind that hums before a storm. Smoke still hung low over the valley, sweet and metallic. The people, dazed and sleepless, walked through the streets as if afraid to speak. And there, standing where the road split toward the mine and the river, was Samuel LaRue preaching again before dawn. He told the townsfolk that Lena's death had meaning, that God, in his mercy, had chosen to cleanse her soul. The crowd listened in tears, nodding, whispering prayers. Samuel's voice wrapped around them like heat. The guilt that should have burned in their hearts turned to reverence. The angel had spoken. No one dared doubt him. Sheriff Amos Calloway stood on the fringe of the gathering, hat pulled low, watching. He noticed how Samuel never flinched at the smoke rising from the ruins behind him, how the man's boots left no soot when he stepped across the blackened soil. Amos felt his jaw tighten. He had buried men before, seen what fire did to flesh. What he saw now didn't fit any logic, he knew. Not the kind that came from heaven, nor the kind that belonged to men. By midday, Samuel's command over Hollow Creek deepened. He summoned the town's council to the old church, insisting they consecrate it as the sanctuary of burning grace. They obeyed without pause. Inside the charred pews, dust floated like heaven's ash. Samuel knelt in the center aisle and began to pray aloud. The floor creaked beneath him. From outside, a sudden gust pushed open the doors, scattering embers across the ground. Some said they saw the flames rise and fade around his hands, tracing faint orange halos in the air. That night he announced something new, the ritual of cleansing. Every household, he said, must bring something impure, a possession, a memory, a sin, to burn before the altar. Only then could Hollow Creek be fully reborn. The people accepted without question. Even the skeptical tavern owner, Walt Hensley, boarded up his windows and joined the others at the church, carrying with him his whiskey ledgers, muttering that sin was too heavy to keep. The first ritual filled the air with a strange energy. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting their turn by firelight. Children clutching dolls, mothers holding faded photographs, miners offering rusted tools, all fed the flames. As each object burned, Samuel spoke the same phrase, purity through release. The crowd repeated his words like a tide, their voices trembling between awe and unease. When Amos stepped inside the church, something in his chest seized up. The place smelled of oil and scorched pine. The flames burned high, too high for the small basin Samuel used, yet the preacher stood only inches away, robes untouched by heat. The purified surrounded him, expressionless, eyes flicking, almost glowing in the shifting light. Amos remembered battlefields and bonfires, but this felt different. This heat wasn't from fire, it felt alive. Later that night, the sheriff walked down to the river to clear his thoughts. The stars hung heavy over the water, their reflections quivering. He knelt, washed his hands and felt grit in the current, ash drifting from upstream. In the reeds nearby, movement caught his eye. A figure crouched pale, watching. It was Clara May Denson, the girl Samuel had healed. Only now she looked frail again, her skin ghostly under the moon. When Amos called out, she didn't flee. She only said, "He promised to make me whole." Amos stepped closer, but she was already crying. She whispered that she often woke in the night to the sound of flames crackling under her window, only to find Samuel standing outside, praying. "He says it's the light keeping the sickness away," she murmured. "But I can smell the burning. It's always there." She looked at Amos then, terror crowding her eyes. "He said if the light goes out, so will I." Before Amos could ask more, she ran, and in her wake the sheriff saw what she had dropped in the dirt, a small wooden carving of an angel, its wings blackened at the edges, its face carved into silence. The following days blurred together. The drought sharpened, animals collapsed in fields, the creek shriveled to mud. Samuel preached harder, louder. The sermons once gentle, now cut like sermons of war, each line urging faith, loyalty, obedience. Those who questioned were reminded of Lena Cobb's fate, and those who obeyed began to speak of seeing visions, wings in the smoke, fire dancing like feathers above the altar. On the 7th day after the burning, Amos found a note slipped under his door. The handwriting was shaky, rushed. It read only 3 words: "The purified come." That night they did. 5 of them, faces hidden under wet cloths, pounded on his door after midnight. Amos rose silently, rifle ready. He heard their chants outside, low and rhythmic. When he cracked the window, he saw them circling his yard, each holding a lit torch. One of them stepped forward, the tall figure with the scarred jaw, Jonah Burr, a miner Amos had once arrested for theft. Jonah's voice wavered. "He says your doubt is poison, Sheriff. You must burn it out." Amos opened the door, rifle aimed, and the chanting stopped. Only the sound of the torches filled the air. The sheriff said nothing. Neither did they. For a long moment, it was as if both sides waited for someone unseen to decide. Then Jonah lowered his torch. "You'll see," he said. "When the angel lights the way, all will burn clean." They turned and left as quietly as they came, their flames shrinking into the distance. Amos stood at the doorway long after they vanished, heart beating slow and heavy. He looked down and saw that in the dirt where they had stood, the ground was scorched into the faint outline of wings. By dawn, the sheriff packed his horse and headed to the next town, 20 miles north, hoping to find a telegraph line. He planned to send a message to the state marshal asking for help, but halfway down the trail, smoke rose again, from the valley behind him. He turned in the saddle, watching black columns twist into the sunrise. It wasn't just one fire this time, it was several. And as he watched Hollow Creek burn from the ridge, wind carried faint echoes of Samuel Leroux's voice rising from below, steady and calm, like a hymn prayed through the roar of flame. From the ridge above Hollow Creek, the smoke rose like a living thing, sprawling, breathing, whispering across the dawn sky. Sheriff Amos Calloway sat motionless on his horse, watching the black plumes twist above the valley that once held his home. His first thought was that this was the end. But then, faintly, beneath the crackling of fire carried by the wind, he heard voices, singing. The hymn floated over the hills, the same one the townsfolk had sung at the river revivals, a slow, haunting chant. The rhythm pulsed like a heartbeat. It was too organized to be panic. Amos knew right then the fires weren't accidents. They were offerings. He urged his horse forward, back toward the valley. The trail cut steeply down through rows of scorched grass, the morning light painting every remaining leaf the color of polished copper. As he neared the edge of town, he saw them, figures standing among the flames, not running, not shouting, standing. Some held hands, others stared blankly into the fire as if waiting for it to speak. At the center of the road, Samuel Leroux stood on a wagon, his coat fluttering in the hot wind. A wooden cross had been raised behind him, draped with cloth that burned slowly, like a candle wick. His face, lit by the red glow, was calm and patient. When his eyes lifted to meet Amos's from across the distance, he smiled. Amos dismounted and gripped his rifle. The heat shimmered in the air, distorting Samuel's silhouette. As he stepped closer, he saw people kneeling around the wagon, families, miners, children. Their lips moved in unison, praying, tears streaking clean lines across faces streaked with ash. Samuel raised a hand, and the prayers stopped. His voice carried without effort, smooth and deep. "Brothers and sisters, do not fear the fire. It is not death, it is deliverance. Through it we pass into the Lord's light." He looked to the sheriff. "You too, Amos Calloway, you've seen the world's cruelty. Don't you wish to see it burn away?" Amos leveled the rifle. "Step down, LaRue. This ends now." But Samuel didn't move. Instead, he beckoned to one of the purified, a young man holding a torch nearly as tall as himself. The man hesitated for only a second before tossing it into a house near the road. The structure caught instantly. The crowd gasped, then began to sing again. The hymn grew louder, almost frantic, the melody twisting into something wild and fevered. Amos fired once, the shot echoing against the hills. The bullet struck the wagon's side, splintering wood, but Samuel didn't flinch. He simply turned and spread his arms, the flames behind him outlining his body like molten wings. "I am not your enemy," he called. "I am what you asked for. The light you prayed would come." The sheriff's resolve held, but his hands trembled. "You're no light," he said quietly. "You're just another man hiding behind fire." Before he could fire again, the hymns broke into screams. Behind the church, one of the burning houses collapsed, sparks sweeping into the crowd. Samuel didn't even look back. He shouted something to the purified, who began driving the remaining townsfolk toward the river with torches in hand. "The cleansing must be complete," he bellowed. Amos ran toward them, shoving through the panicked crowd. He caught sight of Clara May among the chaos, her nightgown torn, her small wooden angel still clutched in her fist. She stared at the burning water as if waiting for Samuel's command. When Amos reached her, she turned slowly, eyes glistening like polished glass. "He said we'd rise through it," she whispered, and stepped toward the flames. Amos grabbed her arm and yanked her back, dragging her away from the inferno. She screamed and fought, but he held tight, carrying her into the shadows beyond the main street. When they reached an old storage barn near the outskirts, Amos kicked the door open and pulled her inside. "You listen to me," he hissed. "That man's not saving you. He's killing everyone." She shook her head violently, tears cutting through the soot on her face. "You can't stop him. He's already seen it, all of this. He told us what would burn, who would fall. It's all happening like he said." Outside, the thunder of collapsing wood echoed through the valley. Amos forced her to the floor as sparks drifted through the gaps in the walls. "Clara, look at me," he said. "You and I are leaving this town tonight. No more praying, no more fire." For a moment her breathing slowed. Then she whispered, "He'll know." "He always knows." Amos didn't answer. He looked out through the slats at the burning skyline and saw figures moving toward the hills, the purified, spreading the fire road by road, their chants carrying over the crackling blaze. He could almost feel the valley exhale as each torch touched timber. Hollow Creek, his home, was dying, and Samuel LaRue was its patient executioner. When the first light of morning broke, Amos loaded his horse again, pushing Clara up beside him. The road north was still open, though smoke clawed at the edges. As they rode through the haze, Amos glanced back one last time. At the center of town, where the old church stood, flames spiraled around the steeple like a crown. And from within that burning heart, Samuel's voice rose clearly, cutting through distance and wind. "Let the fire guide you home." It was not a shout. It was a benediction. Amos turned away. There would be no peace left in Hollow Creek, only ashes and whatever stories the survivors would dare to tell. The road north stretched empty and grey under the weight of smoke. Sheriff Amos Calloway rode in silence, the horse stumbling through patches of ash that once were fields. Clara May held onto the saddle's edge, trembling with every step. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, her eyes darting to every flicker of light behind them. The valley glowed faintly, still burning like a dying furnace that refused to go out. Amos didn't speak for the first few miles. He kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for the telegraph post in Pine Hollow. But in truth, he wasn't sure what he'd say once he got there, how to explain that an entire town had burned itself alive under the word of one man. He just needed to get Clara somewhere safe, to clear his head before riding back, if anyone was left to save. By the time the sun rose, they reached the first bend of the river. The water here still ran shallow but clean, untouched by the ashes upstream. Amos halted the horse, dismounted, and helped Clara down. She looked hollow, a ghost of herself. The moonlight fever that once marked her skin had returned, faint but visible. She sat by the water's edge, tracing circles in the mud. "He's still there, isn't he?" she whispered, eyes unfocused. "I can feel it." Even now, Amos crouched beside her. "He's not a prophet, Clara. He's a man who knows how to make people afraid, that's all. You keep your mind clear, and you'll be free of him." But she shook her head slowly. "You didn't see his eyes when the flames rose. He wasn't afraid. He looked like he'd been waiting for it forever." Her words stayed with Amos long after they mounted again. Each mile north pulled them closer to Pine Hollow, but the silence grew heavier, the air thicker. Around midday, they reached a cluster of empty cabins by the old coal spur. The doors hung open, food half spoiled on tables. The people who'd lived there were gone, their fires cold. Yet on one wall Amos found something painted in soot, a set of wings, black and wide, with a single word beneath, "Purified." He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked back at Clara. "He's spreading it," he muttered. "Town to town." She didn't answer. Her gaze had fixed on something in the distance. Amos followed her eyes and froze. Down by the tree line stood 3 men, silent, watching. Even from afar, he recognized the bandages wrapped around their arms, the char marks on their faces, the purified. One of them held a torch, unlit. Another carried a wooden crate. The third, a boy no older than 12, stepped forward and called out something Amos couldn't hear. Amos raised his rifle. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. The men didn't advance. They simply placed the crate on the ground and retreated into the forest. The boy lingered a moment longer, his face pale and blank. Then he said, clear enough for the wind to carry, "The angel knows you ran." He turned and followed the others. Amos waited several minutes before walking to the crate. Its lid was nailed shut, but the smell hit him before he even touched it, a faint, sweet, burning odor. He pried the lid open with the butt of his rifle. Inside lay a pile of scorched feathers tangled with something metallic. He reached in, lifted a small brass pendant shaped like a flame. On its underside, engraved so fine it almost disappeared into the metal, were the words, "To the last believer." He dropped it and shut the box quickly. Clara backed away, whispering, "He's calling them. They'll come." Amos grabbed her wrist. "Then we ride faster." They pushed through the hills until the sky turned red again. Pine Hollow appeared just as the sun dipped, quiet, small, and eerily still. Houses stood intact, but no smoke rose from chimneys. No dogs barked. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. They stopped at the telegraph office. The door was ajar, the key still hanging from the lock. Amos stepped inside. The air smelled of oil and dust. On the counter lay a single sheet of paper, half finished. The message read, "Fire sweeping south, Hollow Creek lost. Request him at—" The last line trailed off in a smudge of ink. Whoever wrote it hadn't finished. Behind him, Clara whispered, "Sheriff?" He turned. Outside, faint figures moved down the main street, men and women in soot-streaked clothes, staring blankly ahead. They walked slowly, methodically toward the square. Amos counted at least 20. Among them, he recognized Jonah Burr and 2 others from the Purified. At their center walked Samuel Leroux. His coat, though singed, was whole. His hair glowed gold in the firelight of the torches carried behind him. He looked unburned, untouched, alive. Amos felt the cold crawl up his neck. He whispered to Clara, "Go out the back." But she didn't move. Her body trembled, her eyes glassy. She murmured, half in prayer, "He found me." And then Samuel's voice filled the street. "Amos Calloway," he called gently, as if greeting an old friend. "Why run from the flame when it only seeks to save you?" Amos stepped into the doorway, rifle aimed. "You killed them all." Samuel smiled faintly. "No, Sheriff. I freed them. I only showed them what fire truly is." The torches behind him flared higher, their light painting the town in living orange, and as the Purified began to sing again, Hollow Creek's forgotten hymn rolled through Pine Hollow like a promise of judgment reborn. The hymn moved through Pine Hollow like smoke, soft, endless, and suffocating. Samuel LaRue stood in the center of the street, framed by torchlight that flickered along his pale face. Behind him, the Purified swayed, their murmured voices carrying the same rhythm that had once filled Hollow Creek before it vanished in flame. Amos Calloway steadied his rifle and stepped out onto the porch. The firelight brushed across his badge, revealing the streak of blood caked on the metal. "This town's not yours, Guy," he said. His voice was quiet but sharp, slicing through the chant. The sound of it drew Samuel's eyes, calm, unshaken. He smiled gently, as though he pitied the man standing before him. "You think I came to take it," Samuel said. "No, Sheriff, I came to save it, just as I did the last." Amos took one measured step down from the porch. The dirt crunched beneath his boots. "I saw what saving looks like, LaRue. I buried it." A ripple of laughter passed among the Purified, dry as splintered wood. Samuel raised a hand, and the noise stopped. "You still believe you can stop fire with your bare hands," he said. "You can't fight the will that burns through men. It doesn't end because you will it to." Amos didn't answer. His eyes drifted past Samuel to the people behind him, ordinary folks from Pine Hollow, faces unreadable, half hidden by soot. It wasn't just Hollow Creek now. Somehow, Samuel had reached this town too. The contagion wasn't faith, it was surrender. From the doorway of the telegraph office, Clara watched, shaking. Amos had left her a pistol, but she gripped it like she didn't know which end to trust. Her lips moved silently, echoing a name she refused to say aloud. Then Samuel turned his head slightly, as if hearing her. His smile widened. He called out, "Clara May, the cured child. You carry my mark still, don't you? Show him." Amos turned sharply. "Don't listen to him," he warned. But Clara stepped forward into the street. The pistol hung limply in her hand. Her hair was tangled, face pale beneath the soot, and under her sleeve, faint beneath the skin, an ember-like glow pulsed along her wrist. Samuel spread his arms. "She is the beginning," he said softly, "the seed of hollow flame. I healed her not to save life, but to awaken it." Clara shuddered. "He said the fire wouldn't hurt me," she whispered, "that I would see what others couldn't." Amos raised his rifle again. "You said you healed her," he said, voice low. "All you did was curse her." Samuel tilted his head. "Curse?" His tone was almost gentle. "No, Sheriff. I only reminded her what fire truly is, truth given form." Before Amos could speak, Samuel turned to the villagers behind him. "Bring the flame," he commanded. The Purified advanced, torches hissing as if eager for air. The crowd parted mechanically, faces blank, their movements perfectly timed, as though guided by one breath, one thought. Amos fired a warning shot into the dirt, but it didn't slow them. The fire only brightened their eyes. He shouted to Clara, "Run!" She jolted, then sprinted toward the alley behind the blacksmith's shop. Amos backed slowly into the telegraph office, firing twice into the torchline. One fell, another staggered, but when the flame touched their clothes, they didn't scream. They clutched the burning fabric against their chests and dropped to their knees, whispering prayers until the fire consumed them. Smoke filled the air. Samuel stepped through it, calm as ever, his voice low and serene. "It doesn't matter how far you run, Sheriff. Fire travels faster than fear." Amos reloaded quickly. "You talk too much," he muttered, and fired. The shot struck Samuel square in the shoulder. He stumbled, expression unchanged, then straightened slowly. Blood darkened his coat, but there was no pain, only an almost reverent silence around him. The purified began to murmur again, louder, crying out words Amos couldn't make out. The wind shifted, carrying embers through the street. Clara burst from behind the smithy, waving frantically. "Amos! The barn! There's horses!" He caught sight of her and started backing toward the alley, keeping the rifle raised. But Samuel's voice cut through the firestorm behind him, calm, smooth, almost mournful. "You can flee tonight, Amos Calloway, but you cannot escape the light. When the flame finds you, it will not ask permission." The barn was dark and half collapsed, but 2 horses remained. Clara was already mounting one, trembling. Amos swung onto the other. As they kicked off, the ground shook from a distant thunder, an explosion from the center of the street. The telegraph office ignited, sparks launching into the fading sky. The town below became a ring of smoke. They rode through the fields, not stopping until Pine Hollow shrank behind them. The world turned grey again, heavy with falling ash. For a while neither spoke. Only the rhythm of hooves and wind filled the silence. At last Amos said, "He won't stop. He's not preaching anymore. He's spreading something worse." Clara's voice broke when she spoke. "Then what do we do?" Amos stared ahead, jaw set. "We warn them, every town, every ranch along the river. And when I find him again, we end this before Kentucky burns." Behind them, far across the valley, the sky flickered orange once more, brief, distant, like the blink of an eye opening. 2 days passed before the smoke began to fade from the southern horizon. Amos Calloway and Clara May traveled north through endless stretches of flat pasture and dry forest, keeping to old deer trails and moving only by moonlight. Each night, Amos built no fire. The air still carried the faint scent of soot, and both of them knew what that smell meant. Fire used to mean warmth. Now it meant Samuel LaRue was close. They reached the edge of a mining settlement called Ashford Hollow by dusk on the 3rd day. It was larger than Hollow Creek, livelier, with the sound of hammers and wagons drifting through the air. The people there hadn't heard yet of the fire to the south. Clara stared at their smiles with a haunted disbelief. "They don't know," she murmured. "They don't know what's coming." Amos dismounted outside the small sheriff's post. The sign swung crooked in the wind, half-painted letters chipping off. Inside, a young deputy looked up from a ledger as Amos entered, hat in hand, coat caked with dust. "Name's Calloway," Amos said. "Sheriff, Hollow Creek District. I need to use your line, fast." The deputy hesitated, eyeing the rifle slung over Amos's shoulder. "Line's been down since last storm," he said. "Post riders go once a week if that's—" "Then find your marshal," Amos snapped, "and start gathering your men." Something in his tone made the deputy rise. Amos explained quickly. Town burned, preacher leading followers, spreading through the valley. At first the young man laughed, muttering something about whiskey fever, but when Clara stepped in, pale and trembling, her wrists wrapped in cloth to hide the ember glow beneath, his smile faltered. "I saw them," she said. "They believe he's an angel. They burned for him. They'll come here next." An hour later, the mining foreman and local pastor joined them. Amos tried to convince them to evacuate the families and set watches along the southern ridge. Some listened, others argued. "No preacher's gonna march through here and scare hard-working men," one miner grunted. "We've dealt with worse than some fancy talker." But Amos saw what fear looked like even when men tried to hide it. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "He doesn't need to march through. He only needs to be heard." Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge. A chill settled over town. Amos checked the streets as lanterns flickered on, one by one. He knew the rhythm of fire, the slow crawl before it leaped. For once he wished he was wrong. Around midnight, the church bell rang without warning. A second later, screams followed. Amos stormed out, rifle ready. From the bell tower, orange light flashed, a torch thrown through a window. Fire licked out into the dry night. People poured into the street, shouting, hauling buckets, calling names. Through the chaos, Amos saw them coming from the forest trail. 9 figures, bare-chested, faces smeared with ash, eyes glinting under the rising flame. The purified. Their voices rose in that same dreadful harmony. The melody was low, crawling, hypnotic. The crowd froze at the sound. Amos shouted for cover, firing once into the air. It broke the trance for a moment. The villagers scattered. But the purified didn't falter. They walked straight through the flames, catching their bodies, skin bubbling, smiles widening. From the smoke behind them stepped Samuel Leroux. He wore a long coat scorched at the cuffs, the fabric gleaming faintly as if dusted with gold. His left shoulder was bound, a blood-stained bandage visible where Amos's bullet had struck. Yet he walked upright, untouched. The crowd shrank back instinctively as he raised his hand. "Brothers and sisters," he called, voice carrying over the crackle of fire, "you felt the cold and the hunger. Tonight the Lord returns your warmth." The villagers stared. Some dropped their buckets. Even in fear, his voice soothed them. It had the weight of truth, even when it promised destruction. Amos lined his rifle, aiming through the haze. "Don't move," he whispered. Clara crouched nearby, clutching the pistol he'd given her. But before Amos could fire, Samuel turned, looking directly at him through smoke and flame. "You again," he said softly. "Still chasing ghosts you won't understand." "Step away from them, Leroux," Amos shouted. Samuel smiled faintly. "I only came to finish what was started." He spread his arms. Behind him, the purified dropped to their knees, chanting louder. Then, with one motion, they struck their torches to the ground. Fire spread through the dirt like water. In seconds, the main street was engulfed. Amos grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the stables. "Get the horses!" he yelled. The flames cut off half the road already. Heat slammed against their backs as they ran. Around them, people screamed and fell, caught in the blaze. Samuel's voice still sounded clear over it all, calm, relentless. "Burn away what binds you. Be risen in light." They burst into the stables as the roof above began to glow. Amos slashed the reins loose, tossed Clara into a saddle, then mounted his own. He spared one glance back. Through the firestorm, Samuel stood at the heart of it all, eyes closed, light swirling around him like a crown. Then he opened his eyes, and though the distance was great, Amos swore the man was staring straight at him. They rode out through the northern fence as debris rained behind them. The black sky turned orange. Another town was gone. Ahead lay the dark miles toward Bear Creek, to the next place still untouched. And behind them, one more valley burned in the name of salvation. The road to Bear Creek wound through the mountains like a scar, narrow and treacherous. By dawn, ash clung to Amos Calloway's clothes and skin so thick it could have been dust from his own bones. Clara rode beside him silent, her face drawn and hollow. The fires behind them had burned through the night. Even now, faint smoke rose to stain the pale sky. Neither spoke of what they had seen. The question between them lingered unasked. How do you save people who want to burn? They reached the outskirts of Bear Creek by midday. The town was perched beside a wide bend of the river, its wooden mills still turning, shops busy with traders. It looked untouched, too alive compared to everything they had fled. Amos dismounted, boots sinking into damp earth. He felt the old ache in his chest again, that crawling dread that fire would follow them no matter how quickly they rode. He stopped a farmer on the road. "You seen a preacher come through here? Calls himself Leroux. Keeps company with a group that don't say much." The farmer frowned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Can't say we have. You law." "Used to be," Amos said. "Now I'm just trying to keep folks alive." The man gave him a wary look, but nodded toward the center of town. "If it's preachers you're after, check the mill square. There's always someone preaching something." In the square, merchants called out prices. Dogs barked and children darted between wagons. Amid the noise stood a small raised platform where a man read from a weathered Bible. For a moment Amos's heart clenched. The man's voice, low, deliberate, carried across the square with a rhythm he recognized. But when he pushed through the crowd, it wasn't Samuel Leroux. It was someone else. Shorter, sunburnt, a traveling gospel speaker shouting about forgiveness. Amos kept listening, uneasy. The townspeople smiled and nodded to the words, free of fear. Clara whispered beside him, "He hasn't reached them yet." "Then we don't wait for him to," Amos muttered. They split up, Amos to the sheriff's office, Clara to the mill's workers' quarters to warn whoever would listen. But every conversation ended the same. The locals nodded politely, sometimes pityingly. Few believed them. "Another drifter's tale," one woman told Clara. "We've heard worse out of the mines. You'll rest easier if you pray instead of spreading fear." Night fell slower here, cushioned by the rhythm of the river. Amos sat outside the inn, sharpening his knife, trying to calm the tremor in his hands. Clara joined him, arms wrapped tight against the chill. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "He doesn't lead. It's like people fall into him." Amos nodded. "He'll come here. Fire always needs something to feed on." The first sign arrived after midnight. A horse galloped into town from the southern road, riderless, its mane scorched and eyes wild. Moments later came the smell. Smoke, old, sharp, and close. Amos stood, grabbing his rifle. The church bell rang, calling the night watch. But before they could organize, a scream echoed from the riverbank. Clara ran in that direction. Amos followed. The water glowed faintly orange. Floating near the shore was what looked like a body, no, several, bound together by rope. The current turned them slowly, faces half burned, and on each chest was carved the same symbol Amos had seen in the ashes of Hollow Creek. Wings. Behind them, someone started shouting from the square. When Amos turned, he saw torches flicker at the far end of the street, figures emerging from the dark tree line, walking shoulder to shoulder. The sound came next, not the cry of rage or warning, but song. Gentle, rhythmic, almost mournful. The hymn of Hollow Creek. Clara froze. "He's here." Amos's gut turned to ice. "Get behind cover." From the darkness, Samuel LaRue appeared once more, his steps slow, deliberate. His bandage was gone. In its place, fresh burn scars climbed up his neck, etched like veins of gold in the torchlight. He carried no weapon, no cross, only that same faint smile. His followers fanned out behind him. "Have you come to save them too?" Amos shouted, voice rasping over the distance. Samuel looked at him with something near affection. "You're still chasing smoke, Sheriff. Hollow Creek's ashes were not the end. This is the beginning. What do you want?" Samuel's tone softened. "Only to finish what was promised. The world won't burn by my hands, Amos, it will burn by theirs." At once the followers broke off into different streets, torches splitting the darkness. Amos fired, hitting one in the shoulder, but another torch hit a wagon and burst into flame. Townsfolk poured from doorways, confused, shouting, running straight into the chaos. The hymn swelled as more torches lit up the night. Flames caught on river wind, leaping from house to house. Clara grabbed Amos's arm. "We can't fight all of them." He looked back toward Samuel, who stood calmly in the square, arms raised as if conducting the fire itself. "I'm not fighting them," Amos said. "I'm going after him." He took aim again and fired. This time the bullet struck close enough that Samuel stumbled. But before Amos could reload, a wooden beam collapsed between them, sparks blinding his sight. When he stumbled through the smoke seconds later, Samuel was gone. By morning, Bear Creek smoldered in ruin. Survivors huddled on the riverbank, silent, watchful. Ash fell like snow over the water. Clara sat beside Amos, her voice hoarse. "He's gone again." He stared at the horizon. "No," he said. "He's moving north." And as the wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of singing from far away, Amos realized that wherever there was wood to burn, Samuel LaRue's gospel would keep spreading, one flame, one town, one believer at a time. The farther north they rode, the colder it became. The hills turned to granite ridges, the air sharp enough to scrape breath into frost. Ash no longer clung to the ground, but Amos Calloway still smelled it in everything. The river, the trees, the wind. He and Clara followed the tracks northward for 3 days, through ghost towns and camps already half empty. Wherever Samuel LaRue passed, something was left behind. Burned scripture pages, gutted barns, and those same feathered ashes marking the earth like a ritual. On the 4th evening, they reached Coldwater Junction, a rail outpost built along the mountainside. The tracks shone under the moonlight, stretching east and west like 2 black ribbons cutting through snow. Smoke from the depot chimneys curled gently upward. The lights looked warm, peaceful. too peaceful. Amos led his horse to a stop by the outer fence. "We rest here," he said. "Just for a night." Clara nodded, though he could see how worn she was. The mark beneath her wrist pulsed faintly, glowing through the cloth. He didn't mention it, but he had noticed how it brightened each night they drew closer to wherever Samuel was. She could feel him in a way Amos couldn't. It frightened her, though she tried to hide it. Inside the depot tavern, miners and traders crowded around the stove, faces red from whiskey and heat. Amos spoke to the innkeeper, a stout woman with soot on her apron. "Name's Calloway. We're coming from the south. Need a telegraph and a place to board." The woman frowned. "Telegraph line's been down since yesterday. Some fool preacher and his people camped along the ridge. They cut the wires, claiming to stop evil from traveling through lightning." "You ask me, they're the strange ones." Amos and Clara exchanged glances. No doubt now. Samuel was near. After eating, Amos borrowed a lantern and stepped outside to the rail yard. The snow crunched like glass under his boots. He stopped where the tracks disappeared into the trees, and there, faintly, he saw firelight, small distant points dancing on the ridge above town. "Clara," he called softly. She joined him, breath misting in the cold. They could both hear it, the low rumble of voices carried by the wind. Not words, just rhythm, a hymn without melody. Amos checked his rifle. "We end it here." They climbed the ridge in silence. The nearer they got, the more the air changed. It tasted of iron and smoke. At the crest, the ground opened into a clearing ringed by pine. Dozens of figures knelt in the snow, each holding a torch. At their center stood Samuel Leroux. He looked thinner, his coat torn, his hands bare despite the cold. Around his neck hung the brass flame pendant, now blackened. When he saw Amos and Clara emerge from the trees, his smile returned, serene and tired. "You've come far," he said. "Most would have given up their burden by now." Amos raised the rifle. "I didn't come for sermons." Samuel tilted his head. "Then what did you come for?" "Justice. Revenge." "You burn the same way they do. You just call the fire by another name." Clara stepped forward. "Why me?" she cried. "Why did you mark me?" Samuel looked at her gently. "Because you believed. You gave the flame a home." Her hands trembled. The glow beneath her wrist flared brighter, spilling through the cloth like sunlight. Amos grabbed her arm, but she winced, heat radiating from her skin. Samuel's voice grew soft, hypnotic. "Do you feel it now? That's not curse, child, that's creation." "Enough," Amos said. He fired. The shot ripped through Samuel's chest. The preacher staggered backward, dropping to his knees. The purified let out a collective gasp. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the clearing. Then Samuel laughed, coughing blood into the snow. "You don't kill fire," he whispered. "You spread it." The torches flared all at once. The purified screamed, not in fear, but in some broken ecstasy, as the flames leapt from their hands, igniting their bodies. The clearing turned into a pyre. Amos shielded Clara, pulling her down. Heat seared the trees, snow melting into steam. Through the roar, Samuel dragged himself upright, eyes bright as embers. "This world will remember Hollow Creek," he said weakly, "through every flame that follows." Amos stepped forward, grabbed his revolver, and fired again, once through the preacher's heart, then through his head. Samuel fell silently into the burning snow. No miracle followed, no light rose, only the crackle of fire and the hiss of melting ice. The purified sank one by one, their voices fading. When the smoke cleared, only Amos and Clara remained standing. The wind cut through the trees again, spreading the last embers into the dark. Hours later, as dawn broke, they buried Samuel Leroux beneath a ridge of frozen earth. Clara knelt, pressing her marked hand against his grave. The light beneath her skin dimmed, then vanished. Amos looked east, where the first pale color of sun brushed the horizon. "It's done," he said. Clara rose slowly. "For how long?" He didn't answer. The two walked down the ridge toward the quiet town below. Behind them, the wind stirred the dirt on Samuel's grave, revealing only a faint pattern burned into the frozen soil. Two wings, black and perfect, etched forever into the ground. As they descended, Amos finally spoke. No preacher, no angel, just men lost in the fire they built. Clara turned once more toward the ridge, where smoke still rose, thin and grey against the sky. "Then may it end with us," she whispered. The valley stayed silent, and for the first time since Hollow Creek burned, no voice answered back. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.